So again, I'd like to welcome you to today's TechNet Webcast. This is Real-Time Business Intelligence with SQL Server 2005 Analysis Services. It's my pleasure to introduce today's TechNet presenter. We have Matt Hester here, and Matt's part of the Microsoft Across America team. So Matt, take it away.
All right, once again, thank you, Janet. Once again, everybody, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you're dialing in to this webcast. We've got a really cool one to talk to you about today about real-time business intelligence and what that means and what are some of the challenges in your organization. And more importantly, how can SQL Server 2005 Analysis Services really help you with that? And we're going to focus in on this. As Janet mentioned, you can ask questions throughout the day regarding this, and just post your questions in the question and answers. We have actually a great SQL guru, John Weston, hanging out with us today, help with your questions and answers. So please feel free to take advantage of that and send your questions right into the queue, and John will get to them as soon as he can. One of the questions that we do get asked a lot here on our webcast is, hey, where can I get the question and answer log that we get from the webcast? Well, we normally don't publish that, but what I will do is usually in about a week or so, I'm actually traveling on the road this week, so it might be sometime next week or the week after, I will take the question and answer log that John will put together, clean out all the names, get rid of all the information that might say who you are, and I'll post all the technical information up onto my blog. You can find my blog up at http://blogs.technet.com/MatthewMS. So if you head up to that website, usually in a week or so, and I even have an RSS feed for webcast question and answer logs, so you don't have to visit it every day unless you really want to. But I'll definitely put it up there. Now, a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today, we're going to focus on a lot of what I would call end results. So a lot of plumbing has already been created for this webcast. But really, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about what are some of the barriers that you may face today in your real-time business and intelligence issues, or what are you trying to do? What are some things that maybe SQL 2005 can offer? And that's where we're going to focus the conversation today. So we're going to show you a lot of the end results. The cube's already been created, and a lot of the mappings have already been set up as well. So we're going to focus in on kind of how can 2005 really provide you some rich results in a very quick, timely, up-to-date, historical to some extent fashion that we're going to talk about. Now, you may have questions regarding how to set some of this stuff up in the background, how to actually set up the data mappings that I'm going to show you, how to set up some of the cube and some of that information. Not only is John a good resource, but more importantly, John, our Q&A guy, our SQL Guru expert, has done several webcasts on the topic. And I'm sure if you ask nicely, John will probably post some of those webcasts into the actual queue for you so you can actually get a hold of them. So there's a lot of information that when you want to really do real-time business intelligence, we're going to kind of show you kind of the end result, but there's a lot of things that have to be happening before, and I will definitely point you to the expert there, and John will definitely get you some great information. He has a lot of really good webcasts that he's done recently, usually within the last week or so, on this topic and how to build it. So definitely look for some information in the Q&A log on that as well. So what are some helpful experiences that you need to have as we go through this actual webcast today? Really, as I mentioned, just kind of have a basic understanding of some of the acronyms that we use and some of the things that we use in analysis services. Hopefully everybody's familiar with OLAP and the analysis cubes and dimensions that we use in our data warehouses and our environment to work with these different things. But also, hopefully, you're interested in two other terms, and let me just spend a moment on these. That's MOLAP and ROLAP, or MOLAP or ROLAP. I call them MOLAP and ROLAP. They talk about different ways on how we access data. When you're using MOLAP, you're usually using cache data when you're asking questions and you're trying to get data back from that. And when you're using ROLAP or relational, you're going directly into that actual right into that actual database itself. The reason that's important is because when we look at those concepts, and we'll talk about some of the great things that SQL 2005 does, is that you might determine one is going to be faster for your organization and get you the data you need over the other. And we're going to talk about what are some of those decision criteria today, but make sure you're familiar with some of those basics there. One other thing, and then it's completely new to SQL 2005, is a Unified Dimension Model, or UDM. This is brand new to the analysis services we have, but imagine if you have like some kind of SAP system with two different databases on the back end, maybe Oracle and SQL, and maybe in Oracle they call it customer name, and inside of SQL we call it cus name. Well, how do we tie those together? Well, we have to map them, and that's what the Unified unified dimension model is all about. You're going to see some of that work today, and I believe John told me one of the webcasts that he did that actually shows you how to set up all those mappings and how to do some of that work to tie those databases together in a unified model. But at the end of the day, that's all we're trying to do is make sure that we're tying them together so once again we can get a good picture of what's going to happen inside of there. So let's hop in. We're going to start with just addressing challenges, and then we're going to talk about how we can deliver that inside of SQL 2005. Before we really get rolling, though, I want to kind of ask everybody a question. Have any of you worked with the SQL Service Integration Services and the Analysis Services inside of 2005? The reason I mention this is going to be some of the things that we really core and drive into. So I'm going to give everybody just a moment to take a look at this question so I kind of know where to gauge my conversation today. Well, it looks like to be a pretty close 50-50 split between folks that have used it and folks that have not. So as we're going through this material, I'll kind of just go right down the middle as our kind of our poll survey here shows to match the needs of this that we have. So we have our SQL Server Integration Services, or SIS, is going to be a key component of a lot of things that we do to help set these things up. And you'll see me move in and out of these tools that we have as we go through the demonstrations and the content today. So let's talk about some difficulties in real-time business intelligence and BI. So when we think about this, there's lots of reasons when you look at your organizations, there's lots of reasons that you probably all have of why you need real-time BI, and you probably even have some very different definitions, and we'll talk about that in just a second, of how you define real-time BI and what kind of different things that you can get into. So maybe you have some kind of point-of-sale system with an online transaction processing, and you want to be able to pull data from that environment, and you want to be able to bring that up-to-date information. And you know, today OLTP is really, really good at doing this for you. But what happens when you have all this other information, when you have other areas to bring in together, when you have other kind of OLAP systems you want to tie together, or more importantly, what if you want to start tying in some historical data so that maybe you can do some just basic analysis. Okay, during the morning we have more traffic than in the afternoon, or if we have a quiet morning, we know we're going to have a busy afternoon. So those are some challenges that we have today, and how do we tie all that disparate data together, and how do we actually bring it into to work with that data in that environment. At the end of the day, we want to be able to bring all this in through the unified dimension model and bring it into what is called a production cube, as most of you are probably familiar with, and even through those environments to help validate and give that data back to those users in a simple and fast fashion. So it really depends on how do we combine all this up-to-date data that we have that's in the OLTP databases and combine that with historical data, and then bring all this together. And that's what we're going to talk about today. That's what we call real-time business intelligence. Being able to pull all that data so we're not looking at stale data, so we're not looking at data that needs to be updated, or how do we handle frequent updates, especially if the database is being constantly updated inside of our environments. Really, when you look at real-time BI, it's kind of just a single point of truth. It's a single area we go that contains hopefully the up-to-date information that you have with the historical context that will allow you and your organization to help make good decisions based on what you have. One thing that's very important to note here, and this is going to be different for everybody that's listening to me right now, is that real-time business intelligence is really, and I like this phrase, what we're talking about here, it's real-time enough. Now, what does that mean? It means it's real-time to your limitations and demands as your organization. What can you do within your technology? What do you need from a service level agreement inside of it? So at the end of the day, real-time to your organization may mean, hey, the data, it's fresh within the last day, or it might be within the last hour. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that the data is up to the second accurate to be considered real-time for your organization. So when you think about real-time and you think about the challenges that we have inside of there, what you really want to look at is that we're talking about from the standpoint of working with what's real-time to your organization and how do you define it inside of there. So when we connect all these OLTP together and we run them through the SQL Service Integration Services to maybe do some basic cleansing of the data, maybe some pre-calculated aggregate values, some different things, some maybe summaries, we're allowed to do this. But what happens when we start moving data, and what happens to some of the latency that we're going to have when we move that data, for example, from the data warehouse to maybe the staging cube, where it then goes through another validation process before we actually get it into the production cube. Sometimes that latency can really cause problems, not only from your side, but also from the end user's environment. And really, at the end of the day, what does this cause? It causes time. It causes delay. Folks can't get answers to questions that they need to know right away. So we have to be able to look at all those different things and factor them in when we're talking about real-time business intelligence, and what does that mean to your actual organization, and what different things can we actually do to solve those problems inside of it. More importantly, throughout the webcast today, we're going to talk about how does SQL 2005 actually do that for you, and how easily it is. Because everything I'm going to show you, folks, is very, very straightforward to do once you have that plumbing put in place and you have that have your business metrics put inside of it. So when we think about it, what are some other barriers that we have? Managing aggregate sets of data, isolating OLTP from long-running queries. I mean, we all know that query, if it kicks off, it's just going to take up the system resources that we have. What about if changes happen? What about being able to link back to the source system? This is where we have some things that are nice, and you're going to see one of them here in just a second around what is called data push and proactive caching that's going to allow us to see that data and actually work with it very, very easily. And we'll talk about proactive caching a little bit later in the webcast, but it's something that's very exciting of how we work with our actual environment, how we actually work with our data inside of our databases, and how can we make sure that cache is as up to date as we can make it. The great thing about this, folks, as you'll see in some of the demos we'll do today, is that a lot of the stuff, once you get it set up, it's going to be automatic and it occurs for you. So once you set up everything behind the scenes, and I'm going to show you some of that today, this is really just flip the switch and go. It's built-in technology. It's very easy to set up. It's just a matter of knowing how those things are working inside of your environments. So, well, what do we think about pushing data into the UDM? You can actually put data directly in, and this will be the first demo we'll take a look at here in just a moment, directly into your unified dimension model. You can actually put it right into the actual cube if you want to. It all depends on how you put data in and how you want to work with it, but really at the end of the day, this is where the integration services really help you process this data in a very visual. And I'm going to step you through a little bit of a demo to show you how this process would look, how it actually sets it up. The great thing about this is that when you're doing this push, and when you're actually pushing the data inside the Unified Dimension Model, the UDM model, it includes the fact and dimension table. So it makes it very easy to work with some of that plumbing underneath to help set some of that mapping up. And that's some of the things that we're going to take a look at right now, as a matter of fact. So the first thing we're going to do is just talk generally about how to view the SSI package, how to run it, how to work with the actual update cube, and just some of the general basics of working with this environment. So let me go ahead and switch on over to my virtual PC, and let me minimize my studio down. So I just have a couple virtual servers running now. One just with the basically domain function and some SQL on it as well that we'll dig into in the next demo. And the server that we're going to see most of right now, the C-SQL 01, which is my primary server. It has a little bit of everything on it running. So if it's a bit pokey, it's just the nature of it. You think about all the cool technology that I'm running here on my laptop. I'm going to be able to show you a lot of this really cool things built right into the environment. Now, one of the first things that we're going to go into and actually work with is what is called the SQL Server Business Intelligence Developmental Studio. Now, this is a cool little tool because it's basically a special version of Visual Studio designed to work with SQL Server 2005. And some of you, I know probably half of you have probably used this tool based on the question I asked earlier, and some of you have not. So depending on the folks that have never used this tool, you might think, oh no, Visual Studio, maybe I don't want to be a developer, maybe I'll go do something else. Trust me, folks, this is really just a tool designed to help you get into your data. So if you understand databases, this tool is fairly straightforward to work with and use. So I'm going to go ahead, I've already opened up a project. I've already set it up, but right now I'm inside of this tool and I'm actually looking at one of my cubes. For this example, I am using our friend AdventureWorks as my example cube, as I will use in other demos as well. It's just basically a sample version. It's just a sample cube that we can get when we load the product so we can work with it and play with it. The great thing for you folks is that there's lots of ways to get a hold of this technology and work with it where you don't have to necessarily play with your production data, although ultimately that's what you're going to need to do. But if you're just trying to figure out how things work and how they set up, use that AdventureWorks database, folks. You know as well as I do, even in the past. In the Northwind Traders, it was a good database because we didn't really care about it that much, but we want to be able to have something to test and blow up with. I also want to mention as we go through, there's a whole bunch of virtual labs and how to do a lot of the stuff that we're doing now that are free. All you have to have is a Passport account. So if you want to play with this, and I think ultimately that's where you're going to learn it the best, definitely look at some of those virtual labs, folks. So enough with the commercial. Let me just show you some of the things that we can do. So all I'm going to do here is add a couple fields into my area and kind of show you what my table looks like, and then show you how I can actually do some pushing of data into the actual cube. So I'm going to go ahead and add in just an order quantity here into my data field. And then I'm going to add in some product information. Specifically, I'm just going to go ahead and add in the product category. Gives me some just general what's there. I'm going to add in color. Just dragging and dropping over. Most of you have done this before, so I can start getting an idea of what's there and the actual data that I'm set up and working with. And then maybe I'll just throw in product name as well. So I can get a general idea that I have some shirts, and if I go to blue, I have some classic vests, large, medium, and small. I don't have any other sizes, but this is just a quick peek of what that data. I'm just quickly just browsing that actual data that's there. Very easy to do, as most of you, for those of you who've never seen it, I'm just basically, a pivot table, just looking into that cube, for lack of a better analogy, to work with this. So now, what are some of the nice things? So we know what this data looks like today. How do we add or how do we modify it? Well, one of the things that you can actually set up is that as you have new data that arrives into your source systems, the relational database that's going to get loaded in the cube as well, so we want to make sure we have up-to-date information. We do this with the Integration Service Packages, or SSIS packages. This package consists of two tasks that we're going to take a look at today. So let me go ahead and bring up my package. It'll take a second to chug. But the package that you're going to see here is going to have two tasks. The first is going to help analyze and get any new products from a relational database and add them directly into the analysis cube. Now the logic that we're going to set up is that, yeah, we don't want to add orders until we add the actual new products. So you're going to see that in just a moment. And that's going to be the second task, is actually adding orders to my environment. So this is going to take a second to come up here. Apologize for the delay, but what we're going to look at here is how we actually follow the logic inside of our package, and how the SQL Server Designer makes it real easy to do these types of things. I'm telling you, folks, it's very straightforward to do, and there's a little bit of underneath components that you have to understand for the mapping to get it to all work. But once you get it set up, it's just a matter of making sure you have the right logic and the right data flow and the control flow for your data to actually work with. So it looks like it's chugging. It's about ready to bring it up for us so we can actually look at it and understand some of the areas that we're going to see inside of here. So right now what you see is basically my flow. I have add new products, then I have add new orders. Real basic, and I'm willing to bet that your flows in real life are going to be a whole lot more complicated than this. But I just want to show you some of the functionality that's here, is that why do we add new products before we add orders? Well, we don't want to take orders until all the products are up to date. So kind of makes sense just a little bit here. So let's take a look at the add new data products. So I'm just going to go ahead and double click on it to drill into what's there. And inside of here, you're going to see, hey, I just have information that's related to this. So I have my get new products. I also have what is called a dimension processing destination. Now this is a new data destination for SQL 2005. And what are some of the things that we actually have inside of here? So let me go ahead and drill this in. By the way, you have what is called the, I don't know if you guys see the little thing, it looks like a pair of sunglasses over top of a table. This is the database viewer. We'll talk more about that later, but just wanted to point it out now as we're looking at it. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on dimension processing. And this is going to bring me up some information about this particular processing, about this particular destination, different things that I can work with. That's very important that we understand. So when we look at this, we're inside the product dimension right now. So we're just looking at, hey, I want to get output from the get new products task. We've also specified inside of here, over here on the right, it says, hey, I want to add information in an incremental fashion. With this option, when we set this incremental option, really what it amounts to is that this package is only going to add new additions to this dimension instead of reloading all the products. So at the end of the time, what are we doing that for? It's to save time for us. It's to actually help make our environment. Now, if you wanted to do full reloads every time you had a change, you could do that as well. Those are the different changes that we have. So for the most part, this main screen, that's all we're controlling is how we're going to process the data. Now, how do we know where the data is going to get put into the cubes and how we set things up? You set this up inside the mapping section. And this is the webcast that I was referring to earlier that John has done some of these things that show you all these other things of how to get those input columns and how to do some of the backwards plumbing, which we've already done. And all these mapping section does is help me specify my input columns from my source database to the actual dimension database that we have, or the product dimension that we want to go to. These have to be one-to-one mappings in order to load the data directly into the dimension. If you do more than one, they're not going to be able to load it. But you get a general idea of what some of this looks like inside of our environment and actually work with it. So let me cancel out of this and let me hop over to the control flow tab to kind of give you a little bit more of another look at the add orders area. So the data flow kind of gives us some information. The control flow shows us the main. I'm going to drill into add new orders. And notice that inside the add new products task, once again, this is another fairly simple task that we have. And all we're doing here is we're basically bringing in complex transformations of the data, but we're just going to load it directly in the cube. So we don't really have to do anything major. There could be tons of different things that we have, tons of different complex things that we could do before we bring it inside of there. But we also have another new destination here. It's called the partition processing destination, which you should see right here. Let me go ahead and bring it up. The partition processing destination really is, it helps us, when we get the data, it helps us specify the data we receive from the source is going to be added to the proper partition on the cube. So all we're doing here right now is making sure that we're setting this up. Once again, just like we did with the dimension processing destination, we can map, we can do this process incrementally, a full update. We also have to have mappings here, and as with the dimension processing, we also have to have one-to-one mappings to make sure this works as well. So we get an idea of how we can actually map these into the partitions and the data we get into the cube. Once again, all you're setting up here is making sure that we can actually move the data directly and push it directly from inside of the integration services package directly into the environment. So all I want to do is take you a quick one other step, and then we'll go back and we'll talk some more about some of the things that we can do. So let me cancel out of this. And I'm going to go ahead, I have a little package fired up in the background, so I'm going to go ahead and start it. And you'll notice it'll take a second to come up, and it's going to break. It should break, hopefully. At a point where it's going to show you the data that's going to be added. And I'll let you see that here in just a second as soon as it comes up. It'll take just a moment to chug. But what I'm actually doing now is I have this package and I'm actually going to add an order in via this package that will show up immediately into that cube. Now think about this, is that as we can actually update this data, what other ways can we work with it? What other ways can we actually set this up? Now, yeah, you could set this up manually. You could do it just like we did here to maybe quickly add new data to the cube as it's coming to the database, or you could automate this process. There's all kinds of ways to get data here. I'm showing you definitely a very manual process to do this type of work, but at the end of the day, you can definitely schedule these types of packages, and it's just a matter of setting the flow to work for you automatically. So let me go ahead and shrink some of these windows down here a little bit. And it's going to take a second to come up here. It's still chugging in the background. There we go. It's still coming up with my data visualizations to show you kind of what's happening behind the scenes here. So move that down. And let me bring up my visual data just to kind of show you what's happening. So I don't know if you remember, but when we looked at the actual data cube, we didn't have extra large and we didn't have extra small, and that's what this process is doing right now. So it's actually broken into this area to kind of give an idea of what's happening. If I hop over to the control flow, you get an idea visually of what's happening inside of that system to actually work with and actually set up inside of here. And right now you can see that it's broken, but these are the two records that I'm actually going to add in inside the environment. Now the nice thing about this, and I set this up so it would fail, just to kind of give you an idea, when things go wrong inside of here, you're going to see, let me go ahead and bring up my dimension here. you're going to see these different things add or error out as things might happen. So some of the errors that you might have is you might not have permissions, or this process may not be working, but this is going to be a great tool to help you visualize and see what's going on inside of that actual environment. So in this first demo, all we did was we took a look at how to actually push data directly into our cube via SSIS. Now, bear in mind, all we did is we did that very manually. But at the end of the day, folks, you can do this automatically. So you can actually set this up so it occurs without having to have any interference from you or the type of work that we can do. So these types of information can be up to date. Now, if you think about it, that's how one of the ways that we can make sure that our data in our cubes are up to date fairly quickly. We can create these packages that fire off when changes. But depending on what you want to do, you may not even have to do that directly. You may not have to do direct data push. It's just one way that we can offer real-time business intelligence with SQL 2005. What's the other ways? Well, the other ways happen to use some of the technologies that I mentioned earlier around MoLAP and RoLAP, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. But at the end of the day, we're talking about how do we start delivering it? What are some other things that we have that we can work with inside of SQL 2005. The first thing is what is called trickle feeds. Trickle feeds allow us to add data directly into our UDM. Instead of having to run packages weekly, daily, or hourly, maybe we're running packages every 15 minutes. Integration services isn't really designed to run packages continuously or like every few seconds, for example, but you certainly can run this every few minutes. In this case, when we're looking at the trickle feeds, Integration Services is going to work with this and update it every few minutes and transform the data. Remember, this is real-time enough, and this is probably going to work for your organizations. What this is going to do is keep your cube up to date within just a few minutes of latency. So we're not going to have, hopefully, any big issues or data that's out of date to make some of the decisions. But we can do this type of work, and that's where some of those trickle feeds happen inside that cube. What are some other things that happen when we talk about continuously changing data inside of our environment? When we take a look at that, when we take a look at changing data, how do we handle updated data? How do we handle when that source data is continually changing? How do we ensure that we are consistent during this processing of our data? How do we make sure that we have data that we're working with is always accurate inside of our environments? It really depends on what you look at and how you define this. But one of the technologies that we have in SQL 2005 is a problem called snapshot isolation. This is built into 2005, and it's a new isolation level that basically allows you to define the data source within analysis services, and then it allows you to specify all the data for that cube has an isolation level of snapshot isolation, which the name kind of gives you an idea of what it does. It takes a snapshot of the data and provides that snapshot to work with. So you may not actually be working with the data, you're working with that snapshot. So how often was that snapshot taken? When analysis service reads that data into the cube, all the data that's read in will be as it was the last time that analysis service started that transaction, because we take that snapshot of that transaction level. Thus, a complete snapshot of a database is taken only when we start that information, when we start that transaction, and we start pulling that data over to the cube. What does this mean for us? Think about how cool this is, because what that allows us to do is perform analytics on an OLTP source even when the source data is continuously changing and we still get a consistent view of data. So what happens here? You're actually talking to the snapshot. You're looking at that information on that snapshot in that last transaction while that actual data and the information is going directly over inside the environment. So we are enabling consistency during this process just using what is called snapshot isolation. Just one other way that we can work with our data and make sure that we're continually up to date. What's another way? Proactive caching is another very important way that we can work with data. With proactive caching, analysis services is basically keeping its own copy, a separate copy of the source data, as well as a pre-computed aggregate data. As with any cache, you're probably going to have several questions, like the ones up on my slide. Has the source data changed? When do we refresh this? How do we answer queries during this refresh process? How do we work with this? Proactive caching is going to allow us to basically define all this with policies to define how we maintain this cache and how we actually work with this cache. So what are some things that we can do? Proactive caching allows us to combine our OLAP query performance, which is better against large databases, which most people will hopefully agree with, but it also is going to allow us to get real-time access to the source data as needed to deliver this real-time business intelligence. So not only can it help improve some of our OLAP queries, but it's also going to give us ability, because we're working with that with the cache copy essentially, that allows us to maintain and work with that data. One very important point about main caching is that when you look at proactive caching, there are policies that allow us to deliver data without having to explicitly process a queue, as you normally have to do when you do some kind of OLAP load and just go scenario, right? We don't have to do that processing to work with that cache. So once again, we can, yeah, you probably are thinking, well, Matt, we can kind of do that today with our processing. Well, guess what? With proactive caching, you don't have to anymore. We're actually able to work with that inside of there very, very nicely and very, very easily inside of our environment. So proactive caching, what happens is that we have our analysis services in the middle. We have our UDM inside of our model. So we actually get some events and we have some information updated. We have data moving in and out of that environment. So what's actually being used to store this data? We actually get the data into that new version, but that new version is going to maybe possibly be in that MOLAP cache. Depending on the date and the time that works with might control how we set them work this up and how we work with it. But bear in mind, the great thing about this is that analysis service is going to allow us to switch automatically. Depending on what we've set for the policies for our cache and actually working with this cache, it's going to determine of when the data gets out to date. Well, first off, the best thing about this, folks, and you're going to see this in a moment, is that you determine how often this cache is out of date. What's your acceptance level? You control when this cache comes back online, because it's going to be updated underneath the covers for us, right? So when do we switch back to that cache for our users and so on? And what happens if the data is out of date? Well, we can send them, and it'll automatically happen, send them to the actual database, send them to the rollup built into it. And it's all set up inside of our environment, very, very nice. Because once again, this is all policy-based, all very, very simple policies to control the actual refresh of that cache, to actually set it up and work with it. So at the end of the day, you can do these things very, very easily, very automatedly, but also setting them up, it's just a simple policy to work with and control inside the environment. I think this is probably one of the most exciting things that we have around real-time business intelligence inside of SQL. So what I want to actually do is show you some of this. I want to show you some of the partition settings that we have, how the cache settings are there. I'm actually going to try to cause some latency, and I will tell you folks that sometimes when I run this demo, I don't do it quick enough, and you don't actually see the switch back to rollup and then the switch back to MOLAP. Sometimes it just looks like I'm running the same thing and nothing's changed. Well, guess what? If it happens, folks, it's exactly what's supposed to happen. We may not always see it. Our users, the people that are using the data that need to make decisions, don't always need to know. They just need the answers right away. And that's one of the things that we're going to take a look at now. So let me go ahead and bring up my virtual server again and hop into my SQL environment again. And I should have loaded this before, but let me go ahead and close this actual project. And let me close that solution and stop the debugging. Give it a second to chug here. And what I'm going to do is open up another one. I'm just going to open up another one of my pre-canned solutions that I have. And the one I'm going to work with is MOLAP and rollup, this one right here. It's going to take a second to actually load the project into memory for us to work with. But all this is just, once again, it's another environment. It's using another cube for us, and you can kind of see over here in the Solution Explorer, just another data source, another cube for us to work with, AdventureWorks MOLAP and rollup cube, to allow us to work with inside of this environment. So let me go ahead and hop into the cube here real quick. And from the standpoint, all we're really doing is going to work with this data inside of here. So I'm going to hop into the partitions, make sure I got the right one. And right now what we're seeing is just one of the partitions for internet sales. So the scenario that we're doing with AdventureWorks here is we have internet sales coming in all the time, which I should have mentioned earlier. It brings up a point of when you start talking about caching and start talking about some of these real-time business intelligence, we're talking about databases that generally are changing on a regular or fairly frequent basis. If you have databases that are fairly static and don't change a lot, you may not do a lot of this information. So once again, defining what real-time business means to your organization is going to be key to actually be able to work with inside of this data. So let me go ahead and drill into some of this information. So when we look at inside of here, you can see, and I'm trying to get my properties, they're not coming up. There we go. Do it the old-fashioned way. And if I look inside of here, inside of my properties, I should see my proactive caching. Notice it says my proactive caching has certainly been set to custom. What does that mean? Well, let me show you where we actually define the actual settings inside of here. So let me bring this up. Let me move it up so we can hopefully see it all. Here's where I actually define our custom settings inside of here. Now, notice up here we have several what they call different sliders on how we work with this. So you can use standard settings to work with these different options all the way from real-time roll-up all the way to full MOLAP. It just depends, or automatic, which is where we're currently at. So it's going to give us an idea of what we're set up. So let me go into the options here so you can see what's actually behind these policies and what some of these different switches and settings actually mean for us to work with it. So first off, notice that we have already enabled proactive caching for this particular partition. So we've actually set up this information for us to work with. Now, since we only got one partition in this cube, it contains all of our internet orders. So at the end of the day, we're going to use proactive caching. We want to be able to keep this up to date as much as possible. So we want to basically make sure analysis service has the most up-to-date information that we have. First, when we take a look at this, we want to update basically the cache whenever it changes. And here is our option right here. So it's update the cache. And we have two intervals here. We have the silence interval and the silence override interval that are going to dictate of how we actually work with this data. The silence override, or should start with, the silence interval specifies how long there should be no new updates on the underlying relational database before analysis services attempts to refresh that cache. Okay, how long is it going to wait? For example, when we tried, what we're really trying to do here is avoid updating the cache when the data is still changing in the source database. So in other words, we want to be constantly updating our cache to the point that it's nonstop. So we want to be able to give it time so the actual real database can get caught up with its real work, and then we can update it after that. So we don't want to always be there. So how do you know what numbers to put there? Really, you have to look at the data and the processing in your environment. The silence override interval specifies that after a certain amount of time, even if the data in the source database is still changing, analysis services is going to refresh the MOLAP cache for that queue. So even if the database is still going, every 10 minutes we're going to update our queue. So that's what I would call, the extent of our latency that we're going to see inside of our database is 10 minutes. At the end of the day, these settings let us specify how quickly we want to try and get the data when the underlying relational database is not being updated. It's our guess of when that data is going to be updated, how we can actually work with it. Below this, we have what is called the drop outdated cache. Pretty obvious what that one's going to do. This is going to basically, when we get an old cache, when MOLAP becomes old, what do we want to do? When do we want to drop it? When you set the drop to 0, what's that mean? The minute that MOLAP, or the minute analysis service detects the MOLAP queue or the MOLAP cache is out to date, guess what? It drops it. So now what happens when it drops it? The users will be reverted back automatically to ROLAP and talking to that database directly to get their information and their answers. Once again, we can configure this into the seconds, minutes, days, or hours, or how often we want to change that cache and how often we want to actually work with this. Now, down here below, and this one I'm going to apologize for some reason. Let me see if I can bring it up. There you go. Down, it's not showing it to me. I love my screen. Down here below, you have an option right here, and it's kind of, I'll have to apologize for my screen here. For some reason, it's not letting me get to it. But if you notice, it's kind of saying, it kind of half of the phrase, that phrase says, bring online immediately. So what does that mean? Is that allows us, is that once the MOLAP cache is up to date, So once we find out, we're going to drop it when it's out of date. But once we get that database, once we get the cache back up to date, guess what? What do? We want to bring that online immediately. And what's going to happen here is that our data is going to revert back to the MoLab cache automatically and behind the scenes. User isn't going to have to do anything. So let me try to show you this to kind of give you an idea of what's going to happen underneath the covers here when we run this. So let me hop out of here. And let me minimize this. And let me hop over to my Management Studio. And actually, let's do it this way. Let me close that down. Let me bring it back up to clear out all the work that I had there. And what we're going to do is we're going to hop into the Analysis Services type, and we're actually going to be going over to my other SQL server that's in the background, DC SQL 01. And we're going to connect to that, and then we're going to do some things here to work with the windows inside the environment and actually try to be able to show you this. What we're going to do in this demonstration is we're going to actually create some latency. We're going to be running behind the scenes a trace to show you the activity on the database. It's the best way I can really show you that we're using cache or we're not using cache is the activity on the actual database itself by running a trace. With the thought process being, if there's no activity, I'm using cache. If there is activity, I'm using the actual database. So let me show you this now. So let me get some information typed in. So I'm going to hop over to the DC SQL 01, connect to that. Give it a second to chug. And when it comes up, I'm also going to open up just a couple of built-in queries and just a couple MDX queries to be able to show you how this works. And then I'm going to bring up the profiler as soon as it comes up. It allows me to actually work with it. Give it a second here. It's almost there. So I'm just going to kind of resize it so I can kind of see a couple things at the same time. If I drill into databases, notice that here's my database here, the actual MoLab Rollup database, which I think is kind of a funny name, but it's always fun to play with. I'm going to go ahead and open up one of my files here, one of my demos. Let me hop up one level here, some of my data files that I have. I'm going to go into here, Actually, no, wrong one. Hang on. Pick the wrong one. And let's go ahead, and what we're going to do first is we're just going to get some order quantities, just do some basics here, and then we're going to do some more work on that. So let me go ahead and just open up this MDX file. I'm going to make sure before I actually connect that I'm connecting to the right database. I want to make sure I'm going to the AdventureWorks database. I'm just going to verify that. All right. Let me change the database here to AdventureWorks MoLab Rollup and click on Connect. And we should be there. And let me go ahead and bring up my profiler. This will take a second to come up as well. And let me scoot these windows over a little bit so I can see. And as this comes up, after I come up, I'm going to bring up a couple of my other query files, and we're actually going to do a little bit of work and hopefully show you how these results flip over just by once again looking at the actual trace that we run. Give it a second to chug. I'm going to go ahead and say New Trace. And inside the New Trace, I'm just going to go ahead and connect to my database server and make sure I got the right server name. And connect. And I have my trace. kind of the same things with trace. All I'm going to do inside the trace here is remove the stuff I'm not worried about. So I'm not worried about all the logging or the connections. I just want to see the actual SQL statements, the actual SQL batch activities running as I run inside this environment to work with. So let me go ahead and just click on Run and maximize this up. It'll take a second to get fired up here. And once that gets going, we'll go ahead and do some work here and hopefully be able to show you how this traces up. So right now we're not going to see, as you'd imagine, not a whole lot of work that's happening, just a couple things, but nothing what I would call major. As you can see, our traces, it's pretty boring. Nothing's really happening inside of here. So let me go ahead and fire off my query here real quick. So let me go ahead and execute it. And hopefully, if everything's working right with my cache, we should see nothing happen in the trace. Everybody see how exciting that is? Nothing really happened. Now, why is that? It's because we're using the MOLAP cache inside there. We're actually working with that data, so we're not going to really see anything. Nothing's happening on the actual database. Remember, we're tracing the real database file, so everything's kind of occurring the way it's supposed to be. So let me go ahead and actually try to create some latency. So let me hop back in and create some orders. So once again, we have internet, we have new orders coming in. Let me go ahead and open up one of my queries to add some orders. So just a simple SQL statement to add them in. Give it a second, it's going to bring me make my databases up. Notice I'm starting to get some activity because I'm starting to bring some information in, which is fine. Let me make sure I have my right server. And let me make sure I'm also connected to the correct database as well. So let me go to Options. And let me make sure, let me switch it to and let me browse that server real quick. I want to make sure I'm going to AdventureWorks DW, my data warehouse. Click OK, click Connect, and hopefully I should be in the right area. Now all I'm going to do after I've connect, I'm just going to go ahead and execute. Now technically what I've just done is I've updated my database. I'm creating latency now. So if everything's working right, and you should see a bunch of activity right now in the log, partly because I am creating the orders, but if everything's working right, what's going to happen is now that I have it, it's actually adding the orders in. Looks like it's complete. Let me go ahead and just clear that log for a second, and let me scroll over. Let me get to my MDX query, the one that I ran at the beginning. Let me execute that again. Oops. There we go. Now notice what's happening here. You see a lot of data being processed. The trace is detecting, hey, there's a lot more activity. What happened last time I ran that, folks? Nothing, right? What did that just show you? It just showed you that behind the scenes, and this is what's really cool, is that I was on the cache, database got out of date, I went back to the real database to handle the answers and the questions. You saw that activity. Now what also should be happening as I'm talking to you is that that MOLAP cache should be getting updated. So hopefully here, in just a few seconds, the next time I run this, and let me go ahead and clear it again. Next time I run this, we shouldn't see any activity, which of course, you know, now that I say that, it's going to happen. So I'm going to execute this query again, and what happened? No activity. Well, think about what we just did. We went to cache, got out of date, we went to the real database, went back to cache, without having to really do anything. This is the built-in proactive caching. These are the types of things that we can do to help provide that real-time business intelligence, and it's all fairly easily. Fairly straightforward to actually work with that data that we have. So let me go ahead and hop back to my slides for a second. So in that last demonstration, we basically saw how to look at some of those partition settings. We actually created some latency, and we saw the reverting back to the ROLAP, and then it reverted automatically back to MOLAP once our cache got up to date. Pretty amazing when you think about the stuff. I don't know about you guys, but I'm excited when I see these kind of things that we can do. So let me ask you guys, what do you think? What did you think of that? Was it, wow, I need to look into that. Maybe I want to set it up. I'm seeing some questions. Jan, I've been doing that since the launch of SQL 2005, or did I say something? Oh, outstanding. Most of you are excited as I am about this. You need to look into those types of things and where they're going to get into it. It is a great wow kind of thing that we can do, but it's also one of those things you want to make sure, hey, do I have business need for this? Will my business benefit from this? Or my databases actually benefit from being able to work with these types of things that we have inside of here. So most of you, I think, are right in the right kind of mainframe, right kind of mind frame, I should say, of, hey, this is cool, and I have somebody that's been doing this since launch. So you know how cool it was. You probably saw somebody like me on stage saying, hey, I need to have that right now. So what are some of the challenges with proactive caching? What are some of the things that we have? Really, one of the main things is efficiency. And how do we avoid frequent updates? Or how do we avoid analysis services with frequent updates, and how fast can that cache catch up? In other words, without being an overhog, how often can we get this data into that system? Really, the primary performance issue here with the proactive cache is finding that balance in your environment. This is my favorite answer in all of computers, right? Depends. It depends on what that balance between latency and performance are. And inside of any environment, these are conflicting ideas, right? Generally speaking, when we talk about databases and we start talking a lot of data, these are conflicting ideas, and we have to decide how to balance them inside of our environments to work with them. Change notifications is another challenge. We need to decide whether the cache is going to be refreshed when the data changes in the source or on some time interval, regardless of whether or not that data has changed. So we have that silence and silence override. We have to make that decision of how do we want to get it every time the data changes and how often we do look for it, or do we want to decide the cache should be updated every 10 minutes and have how is analysis services really going to know if the data has been changed? How do we actually work with it and design those kind of environments? Well, those were a lot of those policy settings that we talked about. This is a real good reference slide for everybody because it kind of gives you an idea of the different intervals. Silence interval, after an update, how long must there be quiet time with no updates? Silence override interval. If we don't have any quiet time, maybe the database is in a constant state of change, how often do we want to update our cache? How often do we want to do a forced rebuild? How out of date is the cache before we revert back to rollup? So we allow it to set up all those latency numbers. You saw how easy it was to control that. So at the end of the day, folks, it's really up to you and your organization's need. More importantly, how are those databases being used? So having an idea of what's happening in the environment is really going to help you solve this problem effectively for your organization. But once again, we want to be able to provide that data to you in a very quick and up-to-date fashion. And these are the types of things that are real time. So hopefully when you heard at the beginning, you probably said, well, yeah, real-time business intelligence means real enough to Microsoft. No, real-time enough is what it means to you. When do we, how often do we want? We simply give you the tool that will let you make that decision for your organization. So this is how real-time we need to be to make proper business decisions. Amazing kind of things that we can work with inside of analysis services. So what are some other things? How do we handle how do we scale these solutions up? What happens if we have large amounts of data? When we have a large amount of data, recreating the cache whenever data changes is prohibitively expensive, right? This is going to be something that's costly to our service performance and so on. We need to be able to keep up the data without actually overloading either the analysis services or the OLTP source databases, right? We need to be able to work with this without hindering either one of those. And that's that balance, right? That's that balance we talked about just a moment ago. So how do we work with this? There are several things that we can do to really help maintain performance that's acceptable to your organization with hopefully acceptable latency and still give us this real-time business intelligence to our end users so they can make better decisions. First, we need to take a look at using rollup effectively. As we've seen earlier, this is nice to be able to do these types of things. We can also use partitions. For example, we may have a partition that contains historical data from the MOLAP cache and another partition that contains the most up-to-date data from the rollup sources. What does this allow us to do? It allows us to work with kind of the best of both worlds here and mesh those queries together or work with them together inside of it. We can also use incremental cache updates to update that cache. So in other words, if analysis services receives periodic notifications about updates to the source database, we can also use a query to determine which rows in the MOLAP cache should be updated based on those changes. using these solutions, when you look at them, being able to combine these allows you to get the benefits of both worlds to work with and solve those problems and actually work with it. So what I want to do is kind of wrap up the story here with my last demo, and I want to talk a little about how does MOLAP polling queries work, and how do we work with an incremental refresh. So we're going to look at just some of the settings that we have for both our reports and our cubes. We're going to do some adding of data, and we're going to show you how both the relational objects and the cache objects are going to be updated, which is two simple little reports to kind of give you an idea of what's happening underneath the scenes here. It's really exciting when you think about the types of things that we can do inside the environment. So let me go ahead and hop back to my virtual server. And let me go ahead and close some of this stuff down. I'll leave that up just in case. Let me go ahead and close down this solution that we had for the ROLAP and MOLAP reversion. And let me bring up one last project. And I'm going to hop into the AdventureWorks automatic MOLAP to kind of show you what happens underneath the covers here. We're going to take a look at some of the settings in this one like we did the other one to kind of show you what's already been created behind the scenes in the partitions, how they're set up, how they're working with it. But once again, so what we're going to do is show how those changes are made, how analysis services gets those incremental refreshes of cache, how we actually update it. So you're going to see some very similar policy settings that we had in the very first one. But once again, we're just going to be doing things a little differently here for our particular demo. So give it a second to chug up. Now, I'm going to go ahead and open up the cube here. So I'm going to go ahead and just bring up my cube again. Hop over to the Partitions tab. And let me look at the storage settings for this. When we have the storage settings, what it's going to allow us to look is what some of the options that we have for that cache and so on. So once again, I'm back into that basic how we store this data. Let me look at some of the options here. And just want you to note that, hey, we have enable proactive caching enabled inside of here. But also take a look at the silence interval and the silence override intervals. We specified these to 0 seconds, meaning the cache will update immediately upon data change, ignoring activity of the underlying database. Now, we're not going to automatically drop the cache when it's outdated like we did in that last demonstration, but we want it to automatically be update date. Depending on what your nature environment, you may be able to do this, and I'm going to show you how it kind of works inside the environment. We also have notifications. On these notification tabs, we can basically configure what are called our polling queries. When we set this scheduled polling up, we can poll the source database once every 10 seconds in this instance, although we can change it to whatever we want, days, minutes, hours, whatever you want to do. Because we want to be able to control this. Because when you think about the database, and this database in particular contains sales orders where we would expect to have a large number of new roles added to the relational database in a short amount of time. So whenever you have tons of updates to a database in a very short period of time, this might be kind of an early to look at setting to work with inside of here. Really what we're trying to do is tell analysis services we want to use this data as quick as we can. If you're using polling queries to check for updates to the data that changes less frequently, such as maybe a product list or a static kind of database, you may choose to poll that database less frequently than 10 seconds. But once again, it's all based on what's going to be the need of your business. By enabling the incremental updates, let me leave it on 10 seconds here. By enabling the incremental updates in the cache, we make sure that we're not reloading the entire cache when the relational database changes inside the environment. So we have this ability to work with it here. Now, right here in row 1, this is the polling query that's actually going to be run by analysis services every 10 seconds. This is the question that's going to ask to help determine whether we need to look at our cache, update it, how often are we going to check that kind of information. If the polling query that we run returns the same value as the previous query, nothing happens, right? If the values are the same, hey, the data it's consistent, right? We're not going to change it. We're not actually going to work with it. All right, so analysis services isn't going to do anything on the cache. So if you added a new product to your relational database, but the total order quantity hasn't changed, analysis services would not run to process the query. What kind of logic goes in there? Once again, it's a query statement that you set up and actually work with inside of there. In the if the polling query returns a different value than the last query, what happens then? The analysis service is going to consider the MOLAP cache out of date, and then it's going to start to possibly update. But when that happens, it depends on the policies that you configured. When that happens inside of analysis services, it's then going to run the processing query, whatever that may be, to go to the relational database and get the new rows to be added. Since this is an incremental update to the cache, we're only getting the rows that have changed since the last cache is updated. So once again, we're controlling not only how often we look for changes, how frequently we want to check for changes, but how do we bring those changes over? We only want to bring in the incremental changes, right? We don't necessarily need to bring in the whole database every time something happens, especially when you look at a database where there's lots of changes in a short period of time, something like an orders database. So it allows us to work with this very, very easily. So let me go ahead and cancel out of this. Just want to show you some of the settings that were there that we've actually set up. And let me go ahead and shrink the studio down, and let me bring up my report manager, which hopefully should come up. So all I have opened up here is just my report manager. And let me open up a favorite here. I'm going to use MOLAP, just my first database here, which is going to be my standard report for queries against the MOLAP database. It's going to take a second to get up into the screen, but what you're going to do is just basically see an update of an order quantity. Nothing real fancy about this. And I'm just going to make a new window here. And I'm going to this time bring up my relational database. So what you're seeing here side by side, let me shrink the windows down just a little bit so you can see them. Real nice little demo here. Let me drag that over so you can kind of see it. What you're seeing here is the same query, the same report run on the two different sources. One's run on the cache, which is the MOLAP query. One is run on the actual database, which is the relational query that we have in the screen. I should say reports, that's technically what they are, inside of here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into my package, and I'm going to run my SSI, and all I'm going to do is add orders. That's all I'm going to do inside of here. So I'm going to go ahead and fire this up, give it a second to come into it, and I'm just going to fire it. Now notice all it is add new orders. That's all I'm doing is adding to the database just some orders. So let me go ahead and start this. It's going to take us a second just to get the build started and actually deploy it and get ready to run. And then once it's run, it should run fairly quickly. Bring my output up so I can actually see it. And this one takes a little bit of time just to update that query view. But all I'm doing once again is creating some orders into my database. And what we should see once this is done is that both databases are going to be up to date. Okay, now why are they going to be up to date inside of our environment? Mainly because that's how we've controlled this. Now you're starting to see the process of the actual query of what's happening. And really, when we refresh the reports here in a second, since the way we set up our polling queries and the way we set up our information, we can see the cube has already been updated. We're going to see that information in just a moment. It looks like everything's happy. Green is good. Looks like finished success. So let me go back to let me minimize the studio down here. And I'm going to first refresh my relational environment. So we should see a change here, 60,502. And if I refresh my cache, once again, we should see those changes. Because of the way we set up our polling environments, we're going to be able to work with this. What this shows you is that you can control which values do you want to look at. So when we think about polling intervals and all that stuff, what do the polling queries do? They allow you to say, okay, I don't care if that part changes, but if this part changes, I need to update this cache right away. And it's a matter of you to determine what's there. Once again, this is just one other method that we have to be able to control how you actually work with the data and how you can provide real-time intelligence, business intelligence, back to your organization, back to your users that are inside the environment. So hopefully you like this session, but at the end of the day, real-time business intelligence is very, very much within the grasp inside of SQL Server 2005. We put in lots of new technologies, lots of new capabilities to actually be able to give you this out of the box inside of there. So we've seen all these different components put together. Some of the new technologies, like being able to load data directly into Analysis Services Cube, which we did with that add orders at the end. Snapshot isolation we talked about. Proactive caching, so we can work with those caches in a much more dynamic and automated fashion. When you use these together, when you have new technologies in 2005, they're going to allow you to create several different types of architectures and applications to provide that real-time BI from no matter what resources, from many different sources of data that you have inside of the environment, no matter where they might be inside of your enterprise. They're going to allow you to work with this. I've shown you a couple of examples of how we can actually do these types of things inside of here. And I'm telling you what, folks, this is some exciting technology that we can work with. Now, I have something I want to share with you before we wrap up for the there's a website, Microsoft.com, TechNet/SQL-09. And you can download these slides, and I believe the email you'll get usually within 24 hours from Janet and folks will have a link to the slide deck. So you don't have to if you don't have a pen right now, no big deal. But that website, TechNet/SQL-09, everything that you just saw, if you liked and want to see all those demos again, but you just want to see the demo portion, you can actually go up there and download just the stream of the demo. Now, as Janet mentioned, in about 24 hours, a recording of this full webcast will be out there for you to download and work with. But if you just want to focus on the demos and just see what's there, they're up there for you to download. And I think each of them are about 30 meg. So you definitely want to look at that as a resource here to be able to help find data for you to work with. So I'm going to turn it back over to Janet for just a second. I want to send out a huge thank you to John Weston for handling questions today during the webcast. I know you guys kept him busy. I kind of saw the question queue looking at. I'm going to look at what other questions are there to see if there's anything that I can help you out with. Once again, the question and answer log will be put up on my blog, which is http://blogs.technet.com/MatthewMS. So Janet?
Great. Thanks, Matt. And I'm just going to remind everybody that we do record all these sessions like Matt mentioned. So if you'd like to see any of our previously recorded webcasts, well, if anything that's coming up, everything's also right there at Microsoft.com/webcast. So if you have any questions for Matt, go ahead, submit those now. Anything that John didn't get to already, and we'll get to this in just a moment here. So I'd like to point that out. If you have content ideas or anything that you'd like to see us do differently on these webcasts, we'd love hearing from our audience. And there's yet another URL there, so I'd just like to point that out. And you can do get a printed PDF of these slides by going to the File menu in your navigation bar. So just go up to that upper navigation bar and get those PDF of the slides. If you don't want to do that, you can also watch your inbox like Matt mentioned. You'll have an email tomorrow with information about viewing the webcast on demand. Downloading it as a Windows media file, and that email is going to include a link to the downloadable PowerPoint of today's webcast as well. So today's webcast was presented using the Microsoft Office Live Meeting technology, and there's a free 14-day trial. Just go to Microsoft.com/presentlive, and you'll be able to get that. I'm going to point out that you should be seeing a survey now in your slide area. If you just hit that little registered online area, that's going to take you right into the survey. And I'll just let you know that your feedback is very valuable. So take a moment, fill out the survey before you log out. We do appreciate that. And Matt, any questions coming into that queue that we can wrap up with?
Got a couple. One from Jimmy here asking, is it possible to dynamically change the polling intervals? In other words, the data may not change that rapidly during evening hours. How do items such as scheduled jobs affect this? I believe you can, Jimmy, although I'm not 100% positive. So don't hold me to the fact that you can change it dynamically. But I want to do some research to see if I can find you some examples. If you want to try to do some research for yourself, Jimmy, before now when I get this posted on my blog, you may want to look at the scripting center up on the TechNet website. They may have some things that can actually do this via script. But what I'm going to have to do is just do some research to see if I can find anything that's out there or if there's another programmatically way to do it. So I don't know your answer now, but I promise to post it up on my blog, whether I find it one way or the other, if that's okay with you, Jimmy. I don't know it now, but I will definitely do some research. And I got another question from Anthony. Looks like he's planning to go into 64-bit to increase SSIS processing. I'd like to know what added benefits are for analysis services since we are looking at UDM processing. Oh, wow, that's a great question because where do you start on this one? When you think about, I presume you want a very specific answer on SSIS processing. Well, I'll see if I can find something that's very specific to SSIS. What I'm afraid I'm going to run into, Anthony, on a lot of the sites is just the fact that we can do a lot more and the processing is going to be faster in general of the whole SQL environment, in which, of course, SSIS is going to be benefited from that 64-bit increase. So once again, I'm going to see if I can actually find some good data just specific for SSIS, but I'm afraid that I may just find some general data points that say, hey, you put 64-bit on those SQL servers, the whole environment benefits based on the type of data that you're going to be working with. So if you give me give me a few days, Anthony, once again, I'll research it. I don't know it now, but I definitely will track down some information for you, and I'm hoping I'll be able to find some data that's very, very specific. But simply from the standpoint, when you look at the 64-bit increase, you're welcome, Anthony. I just got a thanks from him. When you look at the 64-bit increase, when you think about the amount of cache that a 64-bit environment gives you, you're going to be able to have a bigger cache, a larger cache, which means you might be able to update that more frequently. And those are the types of things that I'm going to look at, although I'm not sure. And then, Janet, as we're going through, it looks like we're having a very similar issue we had on Monday around the events. Going into their getting the survey errors.
And I just saw that, and I'm posting that survey link right now for everyone. And if
Okay.
you just hit the all other users area, that'll let you get in as well.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry. And then Raj has another question around the AdventureWorks database that it has a primary key and an alternate key. And there's an MSDN article there. I'll have to take a look at what article you're referring to, Raj, and definitely get back to you on that one as well. So I wish I had some better answers for this. Normally, I usually have some of the answers off the top of my head today, but I don't. Janet, that's the last question I saw. So once again, I want to say a huge thank you to John Weston, yourself as well, Janet, for helping me out on the webcast. John, I know you were busy today, so huge thanks for helping that out. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Janet.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Matt. And I'll just remind everybody, too, that if you were getting that error while trying to fill out that survey, just hit that all other users, and that'll take you in. And I apologize for that if you're experiencing any problems on that end. And so with that, I'm just going to remind you that your feedback is very valuable. Take a moment, if you can, fill out that survey before you log out. We do appreciate that. And I'm going to extend a special thanks to Matt for today's presentation. So thank you very much, Matt. And thanks, John, for helping out with those questions throughout as well. And that concludes today's TechNet Live meeting. So thank you, everyone, for joining us.